answer any engineering type questions that you might have about the site and about the project. So,
right. And also thank you for being here, Richard. I don't want it to become just a Q&A between the folks and Richard. We really want to hear your thoughts as much as possible. But if you do have a burning question, Rich is here. So I'm seeing, I guess that's not Molly, but maybe Molly's partner in crime over there raising its hand. Do you have a question about the process, or are you ready to jump into our first question?
I have my own question.
Okay.
The first slide showed top of bank for the site. I'm assuming that there's no, either option doesn't include any thought into setting back the bank and raising up a retaining wall and capturing more of the property from floodplain. Whatever gets built there is always going to be subject to flooding. Either option, is that correct?
Well, I think, again, nothing has been decided or created or designed or anything. So I think if that is a concern that you have, then we should note that and just say, whatever happens there, there's an opportunity. What I'm hearing you say is there's an opportunity to reclaim some space or some of the property if you get it out of the flood zone. Just regrading it. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah. I mean, there are very significant rules around retaining walls, but you could recapture some of the space from intermittent flooding, which it currently experiences. And I didn't assume that it's in any of those budgets that we saw in those numbers. Option A shows a lot more buildings than option B, or a lot more utilization of the space than option B. So if you go option B, you would have more space to do something with, and if it's out of the floodplain,
yeah. And we're not looking, obviously we haven't seen any real site plans yet or anything like that, but I think your point just being about look at the possibility of reclaiming some land, right, in this to maximize it. Okay, I saw somebody had their hand raised. We're actually raising their hand in the thing. Oh, Sean, yeah, Sean, thank you. Yes, you're next. So this is about vision for the new Civic Center building or property, so go ahead.
Good evening. I know you want to get to these three questions, and I'm not going to try to derail your process, but I feel like I have way more questions that would need to be addressed, or I would need to be educated on before I could really competently weigh in on what you're asking. For instance, why there? Why does it have to be built on that site? Is that because it's the only available site? I mean, or because it is in a flood zone, so clearly the cost of construction is going to go up significantly because of that. And maybe there's another location where it wouldn't cost as much to build. So I'd like to know what exploration has been done in terms of location. And then I would also say that the building costs seem extraordinarily high, and it could just be that I'm not coming from a position of understanding what's driving that. But I would like to see a lot more metrics on the proposed square footage and where that money is going to come up with you threw out these sort of gross numbers, but where is the detail behind it? I don't think I could ever vote. In fact, I would vote no at this point on any tax measure without a lot more information on construction costs and, why are we building the Taj Mahal here? Or are we just, why is it so expensive? I feel like it's extraordinarily high given what it's going to be used for and where and the size of it. And so those two things are really driving my thought process right now.
Okay. Yeah.
And lastly, I would just say that I don't have a full enough understanding of the Ross Valley Fire District and sharing resources. For instance, if we don't build a fire station and we then draw from the other locations in the Ross Valley Fire District, I presume we're still paying for our fair share of the employment costs, and what we're then avoiding is just the cost of having a station, or do we then share the costs of all the other stations? I mean, pro rata, or how do we actually save by not building a fire station other than the construction cost? Do we save anywhere else?
Any operating costs, is that what you're saying? Yeah,
Right.
through that,
And
yeah.
I really need to understand those facets before I can really give you a solid vote one way or another on these issues.
Sure.
Yeah.
Great. All right. Thank you, Sean. So again, this first question is really just intended to hear from you. This is an opportunity for the town to perhaps do something different now that this facility is needing to be upgraded in some way. And as Sean just said, maybe it doesn't have to be in that location. So yeah, anything is on the table at this point. So that's our first question today is what do you have in mind? What's some ideas that you have for what could be done here? And yeah, Richard, go ahead.
What you're asking is for us to postulate a solution. Like, what do we have in mind? We've been here forever. We haven't been here as long as Molly has been here, but because you've been here for life. So here we have a situation where these buildings are iconic cultural monuments of community. And what you're talking about is what they just did in San Rafael for their safety building, which is to create a truly Class C piece of architecture as a representation of community.
Mm-hmm.
That's the issue.
Mm-hmm.
The town has allowed these buildings to deteriorate to the point that now we have to deal with this.
Mm-hmm.
All that deterioration and mold and rot and the rest of it didn't happen last year.
Mm-hmm.
So this has been allowed to occur over a lot of administrations. The question is program. Do we need a fire facility in this location at a time when the response of almost all fire departments is medical? They are the first responders for a medical issue. The crash trucks roll. The buildings don't burn. They're now built out of materials that are non-combustible. The new buildings are sprinklered. So our model of response has changed. So how do we make our cultural center, which we're confusing and conflating with the idea of a medical/police service center, and calling it the civic center? Because these are not related issues. And I think it's really important to get the program right,
Mm-hmm.
so that we understand what question we're really asking. We're going to build a new icon of the community on this property of some kind.
Right.
Why there was no discussion of CEQA or historic preservation issues
Mm-hmm.
is astonishing, because they will apply.
Mm-hmm.
You don't just tear these buildings down. And as it relates to the top of bank issue, that will be a CEQA issue.
Mm-hmm.
It's not even a community issue. We don't get to decide what we do there. That's controlled by the state. So there's a lot of other parameters here
Right.
that aren't being put out.
Mm-hmm.
And the question of how much this costs, Sean, is critical. But without the right program, the rest of it is just speculative. It's just a number without context. We as a community have to choose what we want our center of town to be.
Mm-hmm.
I've been here for, I don't know, what, 35 years? The center of town is a key component of arrival as you come down Sir Francis Drake and are announced and enter into our town,
Mm-hmm.
where we are. And the great part about Sir Francis Drake is that you can see the iconography of the town from Sir Francis Drake without being in town.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Right.
there, but we are not there.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting sense of separation and place. So
Yeah.
how we create place
Mm-hmm.
is really the question we should be discussing.
That
And
is,
the
yeah.
subset to that is, what's the program? And that
Mhm.
program has not been well articulated at all.
Right.
So as
Right.
a developer and architect, I look for the program first.
Yeah.
Why are we doing this choice?
Right.
Other than the buildings are worn out.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, all of that is really good. I captured. By the way, I'm taking notes also behind the scenes here, at some point before we close, I'm going to share my screen so you can see what we've talked about. And I'm going to ask one of you at the end of our 3 questions to report back to the full group on that. But let me hear just from a couple of other folks on this question about your overall vision for the Civic Center, and you can talk about its role in the community, community identity piece or the program piece, whatever you think the opportunity here, what vision you have for this. So just a couple more minutes on this and we are going to move on to our next question. Yeah, go ahead, Anna. And then Molly will take you next.
So if we didn't have our fire station, there is a risk that our homeowner's insurance for the whole town, the fire insurance, could be canceled, because that happened for my second home. And so if we don't have a fire department, that what can happen? And then my other question is, is town of Ross will be priority if we have a big fire? Will the trucks from San Anselmo come actually and protect our homes if there is a massive fire? So with all of, and I feel that this is an important part of our conversation. Do we value safety first? Or we value aesthetics first? What comes first?
So back to Richard's point of getting the program right. And I think our next question is focused on your thoughts about how important is it to keep a fire station in Ross? So, pros and cons for how important is it to you? You asked some important questions about that. Before we leave this question though, I'd like to hear from others about, your vision for this opportunity of creating a different civic center than exists here. So Molly, I think you had your hand up next. Let's go to you.
Thank you. I really appreciate what you said, Richard, for a lot of reasons. I remember 2010, this conversation has been happening. It's a recurring conversation in the town in some ways for decades. And after 2010, there had been the centennial, and there was, I think an awareness of how, for a lot of people, they didn't realize these were, how old these buildings were. And there was a real interest in that kind of civic spirit of infusing our town, both the sense of place and the sense of history, the sense of always having, our own fire and police protection. And it never really went anywhere. It's a complicated issue, and the Ross Valley has grown so much, and we have 2 very, close and they're fire stations that have great response time. So it's complicated it for many people who've lived here a long time and feel very connected to this idea that we live in a town that has its own medical response and fire response. And with that, I would like to see that the community learns more about this, and I would like to see this happen in some capacity. But I think I'm going to trust that there's a long process ahead of us that involves CEQA and an EIR, and that this is just the beginning of this conversation actually happening seriously in the town. And so this feedback, all of it, I think is really important for the council to hear. And I am eager to hear more and learn more.
Great.
Hi, this is Nancy McCarthy. I'd like to say something if you have a moment.
Yeah, I heard somebody else speaking. Who was that?
You heard John Crane on tap.
Oh, John. Yeah. All right, let's take Nancy first, and then John, we'll get to you, and then I'd like to move us to the next question. I think you're up. So let's just go ahead, Nancy.
I sort of agree with Sean's comments
Mhm.
And in terms of making a decision as to whether or not this is going to be a particular style of building or that's going to cost more, I think a lot of it is going to be key to cost. There's a lot of young families here now. It needs to be the efficacy of the operation of the building, etc. I don't know how much a particular style of building will lend itself or not lend itself to it being, efficient. And I think that until there are real numbers attached to this and response times, I think there was something that came out about response times if it went to the one in San Anselmo. But I think that in making those kind of determinations, that the dollar amount involved and the choices involved are really going to be important. I don't know what the determination was as to the fundraising aspect of this, but in some cases that may be considered a component part as opposed to a tax. Right now, the people in Ross pay, I don't know what it is, $1,100 extra just to sort of live here. And I don't know if that was because everybody thought that they were getting police and fire. I'm not quite sure what the rationale for that was, but maybe that's part of it. But I think that that all needs to be evaluated in the context of asking people for more money.
Very good. Thank you, Nancy. John, your comments, and then we'll move on to our next.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to follow up on what Richard said. The first emails I got really talked about a community workshop. And then there's been a change in nomenclature, which is the Ross Civic Center Community Workshop. And I think to Richard's point is there are two very different items here. One is utilitarian, let's put the fires out, let's get paramedics, the quickest response team possible. The other is a civic center. Very different concept. I think Richard's concerned about that driving the costs up. I've seen buildings that are fire stations in other communities that are really functional, really utilitarian. That's very different than trying to make a statement with a civic center. And I don't think the location really works for a civic center. I mean, we all drive by it and we see fire trucks and police going in. As far as I'm concerned, I stay out of their way because I want them to get where they need to go. The post office is much more the heart of the town. So that seems like kind of misplaced. And I hope it's not just needlessly driving costs up.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you.
Okay, good. Well, let's move on. The second question that we are asked to tackle, and I think, Anna, you already started to give us some feedback on this, is how important do you think it is to keep a fire station in Ross? I think the presentation talked about response times if we don't have the fire station here in Ross anymore, those going up. But you're also, Anna, you raised a point about, well, if we don't have a facility dedicated to fire response here in our town, could that potentially impact our ability to get fire insurance for our property? So those things are the kinds of things we're looking at in this question. Richard?
Who's had a fire in their house?
Are you asking
I
this
have.
group? Uh-huh.
That
Nancy? Mm-hmm.
I've had a fire, but I was living in San Anselmo at the time.
Mm-hmm.
our house was on fire for Christmas 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
We were wakened in the middle of the night on Christmas Eve to alarms we had never heard before. House full of smoke, total, unbelievable. And when we saw the flames, the actual flames rising one floor in the middle of the house, we realized that it was actually a fire. And the young men who showed up here from our fire station were here before I could dial 911. And we were really pleased to see these guys. And they were all this big and, 22 or whatever. That response time was quicker than it took the alarm company to file the response. And so for me personally, on that experience alone, I would question the value of outsourcing fire response to a remote situation for the sake of short-term money. Because all the money we're talking about is a single time cost, which amortized over 3 decades of bond financing is de minimis relative to what happens if there's a failure of service because we made this money choice.
Right. Okay. That's exactly what we're asking your opinion about tonight. So Sean, you have your hand up next.
Sorry to sound repetitive, but I would love to, I would just say for me, the answer to your question is it depends on, and I'm sorry if this is in disagreement with others, but it depends on whether there are any operational savings to what, irrespective of the cost of the structure itself. But if we if we spread our wings, so to speak, and have our response people come from other locations, do we have a net savings, a net tax savings, other than the cost of the structure itself? I can't answer the question because I don't have the data.
Right. But that tells us what is important to you about this, about what information would be important to make that choice for you. Right. That's great. And that will definitely be something we will address. Others of you, so again, the question is, how important is it to keep a fire station in Ross? And a companion question that we could also talk about is, how willing would you be to pay for that fire station to remain? Which is, as Sean said, depends. Are we going to save any money operationally? So those are the questions that we have left. And then the last question for tonight, just to remind you where we're going, is just about how important is it having paramedics services stationed in Ross. So so that's where we're going. So Molly, any thoughts about the fire station, whether you would like to see it remain or how important that would be for you?
I think I hope I alluded to that in my first comment. In terms of, well, one thing I want to say, Richard, I believe you live up a hill. You don't you don't live on a street.
We're in Winship up on the hill.
Right. So that's remarkable. I will say that's remarkable, what the story that you shared. If there was a wildfire up our hill here, the Ross Fire Department is going to fight the fire here in our town. And, as best they can, but we will have response right above where we live. And in San Anselmo, they're gonna stay in San Anselmo. And if they're in Kentfield, they're gonna stay in Kentfield. I believe that's true. And for that reason, I would really love to see fire stay here. Again, I'm learning here in terms of in terms of the station itself. There's a it's a little more complicated, but if I had to choose, would love to keep our firefighters here in this town.
Okay, great. Okay.
And can I add something that I think is a disingenuous problem here of information, in that the town, the people who are involved in this process, have failed to share with all of us that the oldest and largest wildfire fighting teams that exist in the country are the Tamalpais Wildfire Team that operate non-jurisdictionally throughout Marin County. And we have the largest equipment resource and the largest firefighting team probably in the state that's absolutely dedicated to simply fighting wildfires in Marin. And we need more information about where they're located and how they operate so that we can understand what the actual application of resources is in a wildfire situation. Because it's not about a structure fire. And that's an unknown, that's a piece of data that people need to understand how that works. So I know about it for other reasons, but we need to have that part of this.
Great. What's the name of that group you called it? Tamalpais?
Tamalpais Wildfire Team.
Okay.
And they're the oldest dedicated group in the state to fighting wildfire. We have a history of wildfire that goes back 100 years.
Right. So we need to have the full picture of what the resources are within Marin to respond to a wildfire. Now, obviously that group wouldn't be responding to a structural fire, but it's
No,
part of
but
the
in
whole,
Molly's comment of who's going to come fight these wildfires, the
right,
structure teams that we have in the fire departments are not set up for this.
right.
But Marin has its own dedicated set of teams and equipment that
Mhm.
fight wildfire conditions.
Okay.
And because the community is not aware of that, it creates a sense of fear and trepidation that's unnecessary, or at least not founded in all the facts.
Gotcha.
And council should provide that.
Got it. Duly noted. All right, good. Okay, other folks who want to talk about, the pros and cons or how important or not important it is to you to keep the fire station here in Ross, and also talk about, I know we've just presented some ballpark figures there that represented ostensibly how much the construction might be if there was a full administrative, police, paramedic, fire facility versus everything but the fire facility accommodated in that. So there were those buckets of costs. And I heard somebody say, yes, it's a one-time shot, let's do it. It's amortized over 30 years, that's worth it to me. So others of you, how are you feeling about the willingness to pay kind of question? And again, I just want to say that we're not holding you to this vote, so to speak. We're not taking a vote, but we're just curious, what are some of the issues and concerns that you might have as we're looking into this situation? So anybody else want to weigh in on the keeping the fire station or willingness to pay question? Either of those. And Derek, and I haven't really heard from you. Eric, you've been kind of quiet too. I'm just noticing, just offering, if you have some comments, please join in. Anybody? And just here to
I hate
watch.
to always talk, but I do, so it's just, there it is.
All right.
You're asking like a juxtaposed question of bigger cost, lesser cost against a false program, okay, where the costs are not well defined because the program has already been preset as an assumption. And until you have a program, you can't weigh the value.
Mhm.
Like, if we all decided we want fire, now the question is, how do you solve that problem? And the $28 million number isn't a fair juxtaposition to a $14 million, literally 50% reduction in cost. Because you presume the solutions.
Mm-hmm.
So your path to even having the conversation suffers from prejudgment. And so you have an institutional bias based in the way the questions are being asked.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not doubting your process per se, but I think that, as Molly says, this is going to take a longer period of time
Mm-hmm.
to sort through.
Mm-hmm.
Now that you've done the right thing, which is to open up the community engagement.
Right. Okay. Well, I invite you, if you have some thoughts, and you've helped us, Richard, understand sort of what other information would be helpful to, as we move through the process, to make more informed decisions about it. So, and we don't have all of that information tonight. So I think that tonight was really just about sharing the information of the studies that's been done, that have been done, and then also beginning the community conversation around, well, here's an opportunity. If we're going to reconstruct something, what do we think is important to have here? And that's going to include, whether or not we want to keep a fire station housed here, or whether that's not as important. Sean, I noticed that you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just want to say that especially because of, when someone earlier tonight talked about the proposed timeline for moving through this process, I'm perplexed. I'm really frustrated that we're only being given two relative choices, and that the community engagement part does not include from the grassroots level of from a conceptual level of what do we want in this space, notwithstanding the fact police, fire, civic center, whatever. I feel like we're just being given two choices,
Mm-hmm.
and that you know, staff has already figured everything out for us, and you know, that's it. And I think that's really wrong. And on that basis alone, I'd probably just vote no out of spite. I'd like to be more involved from the get-go on the conceptual plan for what is most suitable for that space and the needs that we have, rather than someone telling me these are your two choices on day one. And by the way, we're going to make a decision in the next 3 to 4 months or whatever it is. I mean, that's crazy. For that much money, that's insane to not give more voice to the public. I'm sorry. I'm really upset about that.
Right. So it sounds like you're upset because tonight you were just presented with these two choices. And it seems like there's already been some decisions made that you don't feel like you've had a chance to weigh in on. Yeah. Okay. Great.
No, I think Sean's right a lot on this one. The frustration is, I think the process is hopelessly flawed.
I agree.
And the upshot is it assumes a series of answers, of solutions that are really not in play yet. And a budget based on a set of solutions from a single source concept that may or may not be reflective of all the attributes of this community, which is, although apparently relatively simple and direct, is very complex. You know, Molly grew up here. We chose to come here long ago because of the nature of culture and community. I have used the nature of Ross as a programmatic format for Castle Pines in Colorado, for communities in Southern California. We have attributes of our community that are unique and wonderful that others would choose to emulate. Right. And here we are doing something that is like right straight out of Fresno as an approach to a solution, with no disrespect to Fresno. But this is not who we are. And this process is already off to, I think, really not a great start, because it assumes a set of potential answers that may or may not be reflective of the culture and the history of this town.
Right.
And that's my concern, that it's going to get lost in the process by rushing this answer.
Here, here.
Okay. Well,
I agree. I absolutely
Anna, go
agree.
ahead.
Because the question is, why are we our own town? What sets us apart even from the places nearby that's part of the Marin County, like Canfield and Green Bay? We have our school, we have our police department, and we have our fire department. And that's what defines us. Right, for sure.
Did you say and the bear?
And the bear, right? Yeah. Yes, that we decorate too. It's you know. Right. But if we get rid of the fire department, if we don't build or we don't preserve whatever we have right now, we're never going to have a fire department. Then what would we try to save money on next? Our police department? And then how we're going to operate the school then?
I think we should give up having our own town council, which means
that maybe we should start with that.
Yes, town hall as a daycare center.
Okay. Anybody else want to weigh in here? The last question that I just feel a duty to kind of at least pose, and if there's no interest in answering it, I'm going to at least just have said it. What I'm getting from this group is you're resistant to talk about these as specific proposals because we've gone a little bit ahead of you, and we need to back up and talk about what is important to be considered in this process. So does anybody have an opinion about the paramedic services? I mean, I think both proposals or both options that were presented kept the paramedic services in town. So I don't know that there's at least in that sense, there's a desire to, or a proposal to remove them. But does anybody have any strong feelings about paramedic services here?
I like having them.
I like having them. Thank you, Nancy. Good. Okay. Yeah. Does anybody think that we shouldn't have paramedic services
I'll
here?
just wait. I think it's important to have paramedic services. Obviously, it's the huge percentage of the calls is medically related. But that said, I still get back to why there? Why in that exact location? I mean, there's nothing to say. Like, I mean, if you are in a medical emergency in your home or in the community of Ross, and
Right.
an ambulance comes and picks you up, where do you think they're going to take you? They're going to take you to the hospital. They're going to take you. Are you still there?
We're here. We just,
Yeah.
your camera went back.
They're going to take you down to Marin General. So, I mean, think about that most of the cost of construction is the building and not the land. I mean, presumably we own the land after however many hundreds of years we've had that. But I mean, why that spot? Why where it costs so much to build it? What if we bought a small piece of land right by Marin General, and that was the Ross, you know, the town of Ross's ambulance service, and that's where they're going to end up taking you anyway when they pick you up? I mean, why does it right there? Why can't we explore options that where we could potentially build something for less, and or use that land as a real civic center and not all three purposes: civic center, fire department, ambulance services? I mean, I just feel like there hasn't been enough discussion on a broader level of what the options are to provide these services.
Right. Okay, good. Anybody else want to weigh in on paramedics, on paramedic services?
Well, I don't think it's a good idea to have them at Marin General because then it's going to take longer to get to our houses in Ross. So where it winds up is one story, but where they get to you that quickly and are able to give you immediate service is what keeps you alive. So I think that wherever it be sited, that it be sited, you know, close to town. And I just don't have any idea what other options there are with respect to raw land or land that's owned by the town where something could be placed.
Right. Well,
Well,
even
we-
just
what what we do in this is we do what's called a time response study, and it has to do with the arterials. Waze does a great job of this. When you're located at our town center, you're at the two crossroad major arterials that service the epicenter of Ross. So it is the shortest distance between that location and every house in Ross. And that's your response time. So it's very interesting to have a conversation about go find somewhere else to put it. But we haven't done that study, and no one has a copy of that study because you didn't do it. And the time response for that location, I predict, based on the maps, is going to be the shortest distance to everybody in town. And that's why the fire department wants to be there. That's why the police are located in that location, because that was placed there as the epicenter of town.
Right.
Day one. There's a reason why this is here. We didn't like accidentally grow around that location.
Maybe what we need to do is get rid of the city hall there.
Never. Town hall is town hall as it has been for, you went there as a little girl, right?
Yeah, this is called the can of worms, I think. And Lou, I think what you're hearing, at least from this group, is something that is, I think, a genetic predisposition in Ross, whether you've lived here for a year or forever. And these residents and this community wants feedback, wants to give feedback before the process begins, before, you know, there's been a kind of the process before the process. There's a radar for that in town.
Mhm.
And people really want to be a part of the first process, the genesis of the conversation.
Yeah.
Because I think
Nicely
we
said.
all have, we all have our different reasons for that, but it's important to us. And I think that's what makes this place pretty unique. And
Mhm.
when that process is bypassed, this is what happens.
Yeah.
And I do see a long EIR and CEQA process. I don't think that anything that starts tonight is going to happen anytime soon. I really think that there'll be a environmental process ahead of us.
Mhm.
But I think the community feedback part of it, what you're hearing might just be a catch up. But I think people want the town to know that, we want you to hear, some very diverse ideas about this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Molly.
I think
I have a
I think
question.
yes,
What
Nancy. And
happens-
then
is
let me-
is there
yeah, go ahead.
is there a place where the services could be located temporarily, like at the Art and Garden Center parking lot or something, where that building that houses police and fire be torn down? Is that an option?
I don't know. Richard, I don't know if you have an answer to that. But just also a time check. We're going to be unceremoniously ripped from the breakout room back into the main room shortly. And we need a volunteer to report back on what we've had. And I have the notes, so you'll have something to read from. Who would like to volunteer before Richard answers that question from Nancy? Anybody feel like you'd like to capture the spirit of our conversation tonight?
That's you, Richard.
No, Molly, you had the best statement right there. Your last statement is exactly the point.
Okay.
You've
All
been
right.
nominated. Thank you, Molly, for accepting.
Everybody
Great.
agree with that?
You put that together very nicely.
And I'll have the notes in front on the screen so you can read. The notes.
I don't want to speak if the group, if it doesn't represent what this group talked about.
Okay. All right.
I think you hit the nail on the head, but just include the fact that we need data to make these decisions. We can't make them in a vacuum.
Great.
Okay.
I agree.
Okay, Richard, you want to answer Nancy's question about
Nancy, what was the question?
the temporary facilities?
Whether or not there's any place, if the decision is made to take down the buildings that exist now and
Two major locations. Oh, we're being ripped out. Two major locations. One is the parking lot next to the post office, and the other is the Art and Garden Center. I predict it's the parking lot at the post office.
Okay.
Yeah, neither of those two options are primed. Marin Art and Garden Center is probably not going to want to give up their parking lot for
Precisely.
staging. So we thought about that. When the fire station is being rebuilt, of course, we would have to temporarily rely on San Anselmo and Kenfield locations, and then the police could share the portable space with us, assuming COVID has gone away, of course. Or we would set up other portable locations in that spot. We're extremely limited on where we can go, either to relocate a new site or even while staging for the proposed site. The town of Ross does not own much property, and the post office isn't going anywhere. That's owned by the federal government. So
Actually,
they lease from us.
They lease from us.
Yeah, but they're not interested in leaving anytime soon. So a good